You here. We're especially pleased to have Martin Luther King III here, Randi Weingarten, Dean Solon Simmons, thank you very much, the faculty and staff of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, Dr. Rajmohan Gandhi, Terry O'Neill, members of the clergy, and friends. I'd like to hand off now to Dean Solon Simmons, who is going to do the official welcome to the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution.
Thank you all for coming. This is a great event. It's actually a sort of an astonishing event in some ways. And I should say that I wanted to introduce you to the school and what it is we do a little bit, but I think you've already seen some of the fruits of it. Our two students, these are two students, an alumna and a current PhD student, and you see exactly what we want to have happen. This is the kind of action, this is the kind of theorizing that we want to see, and we want to be a catalyst for progressive change in the world, and I think that we have no better example than what we see right here. So let me... So there's no need for much background for why we're here for this crowd, but let me just point out, this is a sign from the Washington Post that I just pulled this out, and in some ways I think that we can see that we're going backwards. This is from a man, he said, "I had hoped when I was a young man that we'd see a lot of progress now," he said, Mr. McDonald Cash, resident of Columbia, Maryland, "but I think we're going backwards." And here you have an interesting photograph that caught my attention from a Midwestern photographer from Urban Landscapes, and it's Living the Dream books that are left in a warehouse. And it's an interesting idea of how deindustrialization is combining with racism and marginalization to produce something a world we'd prefer not to live in. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about, and where we can focus our attention on this 50th anniversary. Now, you might be saying to yourself, why am I doing this here? Why am I in SCAR? There's actually a good reason for this, and I think that one of the ways that I want to emphasize the reason was a guy named Jim Lowy, who was an important figure, who was a sociologist. He died, actually, that's 1993. A civil rights sociologist, and also important of U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Service. And he was also the Lynch Lecturer. We have Sandy Shelton here, who's now the Lynch Lecturer. So this is a good tradition we have of the Lynch Lecturers and the Lynch Professors. And what you see here is you see a guy who was involved in the civil rights movement, but who was interested in social movements as a power struggle, but also as a perspective of conflict resolution. In a way, conflict resolution emerges directly out of the civil rights movement, and a way of thinking about how we deal with intractable and protracted problems of the kind that we saw born in that movement. We see what he says here, and I think that this gives you a little bit of a feeling of the kind of place, the kind of school this is. He says, "Being involved in the movement was the critical element in my secondary socialization and prevented me from ever being a totally straight academic sociologist again." And I should say that many of us are not straight academics, in the sense that we go out there and we only want to write books, we only want to produce work for ourselves, but we want to be doing things like this, and we want to be doing it at the first order of academic excellence as well, and that's a bit of a challenge. So he says, "My access to and participation in this movement network came at the very time my understanding of sociological concepts was expanding most rapidly, and the fusion produced a sociologist activist who could never go home again." Okay? And I think many of our students would agree with that statement, and that's the kind of person we want to see. Interestingly enough, you may not know this, but Jim Lowy was there on April 4th, 1968. And he brought a towel, and he was in one of the famous Life photographs. And he was deeply involved in the movement. And this also shows you, I think, the value basis, that this is not simply an abstract academic exercise, what we're doing in the school, but instead we're deeply involved in values. He said, "Fate or God also had given me 8 years of knowing Martin Luther King Jr. His life and his death changed my life. He taught me that conflict resolution, a laudable goal on the surface, does not truly occur without struggle, refined in love, and that justice is not fulfilled without reconciliation." And so I think if you take that spirit and you get a sense of what kind of place this is back in the 80s and the 90s, and what kind of place it is, and how this is demonstration of what kind of place it is, you understand what SCAR would like to be. We are a very diverse group of people. We I like to say we bring ideas from all over the world. Our students, this is our PhD cohort, we have some masters and others, but just to get a sense, we bring students from conflict areas to learn about themselves. That is, this is not the abstract anthropological understanding. We want people to be indigenous intellectuals, organic intellectuals who are able to understand things from the inside without being taught. And we're doing very well at that, and we have incredible stories of students who've done exactly that. Not only that, but as I said, we want to have ideas about the world. This is just the last year's books, just a scattering, various interesting presses. But the idea is that it's doing practice and theory. That is doing participating in first order ideas, but also engaging in social change work, applying those ideas in almost a clinical fashion. But most importantly, we want to have ideas for the world. And this is where George Mason comes in. Our president just has a mission, he calls it the Mason idea. And it's that he wants to be the best university for the world. Well, I told him, so do we. We want to be the best school for the world, and we thought of ourselves in that way for a very long time. We started in a trailer, and we've moved up to the townhouse, to the Trulin building, and now we have this lovely facility we're in. And thank you very much. Thank you. And I think in the same way, we're moving that idea of being always, and it was always, it was the Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So that's the kind of thing we want to do. This is just a sampling of the kinds of places where some of our people have appeared. And I think this event is probably even a better example. So what are the ideas that we're trying to struggle? We want these ideas for the world. Well, what are they? Take a tour around the tidal basin. What do you see here? You've got that, and how does it relate to the march? Well, you've got jobs. You've got the Roosevelt Memorial. You've got Jefferson. You've got freedom. Well, what's the and? So Martin Luther King obviously stood for jobs and freedom, right? This is what the march was about. But there's something that's in fact unique about it, and I think it speaks to what we're doing here. The thing that we're doing here, what do we want? What we call it? Well, let's call it dignity. Let's call it human dignity. We might call it identity, but something deeper, something that had been denied, and that we're very interested in fighting for. So it's a way of bringing all these things together, and I think that this is one way to imagine the ideas that we're very committed to. And I think that, as you saw the Time magazine article, I'm sure the cover, I think that in a way Martin Luther King has become a new founding father, the way that Roosevelt in a way had done, and the way someone maybe down the road will do again. That we refound this nation and ideas, and those are core ideas against something. It's a struggle against abuse of power, but also for reconciliation, for a greater, a more perfect union, as we often say. And I think that Martin Luther King has become that kind of a founding father. We were born working with Martin Luther King in Jim Lowry, and I think we are starting to see that we're coming back in some kind of collaboration with him. But here's a little bit of an interesting thing, and I think the movement needs to think this through. What kind of movement does it need to be now? How is it matured? What goes on when you go 50 years down the road? Does anything change? Well, here's William Julius Wilson. You probably know the famous sociologist. And he used to say, and this is back in an era when class politics were more dominant, let's say, than they are now. He said that we needed to engage in targeted universalism. That is, if you want to fight for racial justice, frame it in terms of class. In terms of everybody can benefit from, because then the white majority will get behind it, they'll be able to benefit from it, Social Security as an example, and they'll support it. Well, that was targeted universalism. It was based, this is the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was an idea that basically you couldn't run on the basis of dignity itself. Well, there's an interesting feature now, and I wanted to tell you a story to give you a sense of what it is. This is the famous Human Rights Campaign logo. I joined back in 2002, 2003, my family, and I got this in the mail. And I was a social stratification researcher. I studied sociology and equality, and was focused on occupational stratification and socioeconomic status. And I wanted to join it. It seemed like a wonderful organization. I got this thing in the mail, and it was after the September 11th, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is the Twin Towers. What's going on with this? And so I put it, I didn't understand the connection, right? And so I put this thing up on my refrigerator like that for about a year or two. And then I had a friend said, so what's going on? What are you doing with that? And I was like, oh, well, I don't know. It's an interesting symbol of this new organization that's fighting for the rights of people of alternative sexualities and so on. And they said, well, you don't have that right. That's an equality sign. And I said, oh, an equality sign. Oh, right. And see, and the reason is because it's not just, it's what we call in sociology, it's called between group equality, not within group equality. In a way, what the movement now has to figure out is how do we deal with those inequalities within? This is the class piece. This is, okay, if we promote the talented 10th, now what do? We have poverty, we have all this structural violence. What do we do about it? in a way, the movement for dignity, the various movements for dignity, and this goes for A. Philip Randolph and his role in the unions, as well as Betty Friedan, who was the United Electrical Workers writer. They came out of the union movements, they came out of the labor movements, and then they turned to something else, which was human dignity around descriptive characteristics. Well, they're separate in some ways from these other struggles. They're separable. We need to think about how these things articulate and realize they are, in fact, it's possible to turn them on their side and have an orthogonal relationship. So just an interesting story to think about. Where does the movement go? I call it this. I call it embedded universalism. In a way, the class movements that we need now are going to need the dignity movements. They're going to need the civil rights movement. They're going to need Martin Luther King III. They're going to need people who say, I'm behind this idea, and we're fighting for against poverty, for economic justice as well. And that's going to benefit, not hurt, those movements. And I think that's a new moment for us, and it requires new concepts and new ideas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Simmons. Can you imagine sitting in this guy's class? Well, thank you is a great segue, because that's really why we're here this evening. Those of you assembled in this room represent the people who have really made this happen, not just tonight. And we certainly are grateful to George Mason and the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution for making the facility available to us this evening. But this event tomorrow, and it's something more than an event. I'm sure that Mr. King will talk about that a bit, but I'm here to do that as well, just a bit. It's more than an event. When almost exactly a year ago, I sat with Martin Luther King III and Reverend Al Sharpton in the local office of NAN in Atlanta. And the idea of pulling this together, this 50th anniversary, not so much a celebration, not so much a commemoration, but as Martin Luther King III said, this has got to be a continuation, that the fight is not finished. And so there's something that has to happen beyond speeches. There's something that has to happen beyond saying, we've arrived this far and no further. There's much more to do. And so there is something that has to happen beyond tomorrow. And that something is a continuation. It is a national action to realize the dream, year-long tour. And so those of you who have made the event possible tomorrow, all of our sponsors and our collaborators, Terry O'Neill, and all of you, there's something that we must do together. We cannot do it alone. Martin Luther King and Al Sharpton themselves, as grand as they are, as articulate as they are, as much as we love to see them and hear them, they cannot do it alone. It'll take all of us joined together, Dorothy Stoneman, your organization and all the organizations represented here, as we clasp hands together and move from one community to the next in a national action to realize the dream tour. You're going to learn more about this tour as we move through tomorrow and in the coming days and weeks. And we look forward to your continued participation in this process. Now, we said, you don't want to hear from me. I know you want to hear from Mr. King. And on behalf of Communities Without Boundaries International, one of the two organizations to organize this march, obviously the other is the National Action Network, and on their behalf as well, we do want to thank you. I think Mr. King will do that much better than I am able. But one of the things I can do is to recognize the team of individuals who work with Communities Without Boundaries International, who have really not only put this together along with the National Action Network, this being our reception this evening, but the entire event, the entire weekend. And that begins with Dr. Maneshka Eliatamby, who has just done a fantastic job. And really with all of our team, our volunteers who have been part of this process, Joanne, I see you. If you'll just raise your hand so that people know who you are and what you've done. An incredible group, I can't name them all. We don't have the time. But let's stay tuned. You'll get more information about the National Action to Realize the Dream, America Speaks Tour. And we want your continued involvement. Well, enough of that. I am so pleased. I have the task tomorrow of doing something similar to this. And so I'm going to save that thunder, if I have any, Maneshka, for tomorrow. But I am so pleased. I've known this gentleman for 20 years, time goes by fast. You're getting old, Martin. I've known this gentleman for 20 years, and I've had the pleasure to work with his mother, his family, his entire family, brothers and sisters, and brother and sister. But I'm so pleased to present to you the real visionary of this event tomorrow, of this continuation of the March on Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King III.
Stay tuned.
So Johnny messed up. Let's see here. Our next speaker is, before Mr. King, is Randi Weingarten. Where are you, Randy? Thank you. Actually, he was the president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of our sponsors and champions of this entire program, Randi Weingarten.
Thank you, Johnny. I can't speak before Martin. I do actually want to say 2 or 3 things. This march, 50 years later, was very tough to put together. Not because of the idea, but in some ways because one of the things it showed me, you don't mind me being this blunt, do you?
No.
Was that we should have enduring partnerships that should have made it really easy when Martin and Reverend Sharpton made that first call to put a lot of things together. When Martin's sister made that call to put a lot of things together. And what surprised me, and I don't mean to tell tales out of school, but I remember I was not even in that first group of people that people were talking to. And I remember having a conversation with Reverend Sharpton. And what he said to me that day has stuck in my mind since that time. And my staff will tell you, and a lot of my staff is here, and they have been just amazing. Jen, just, But what stuck in my head was that, left to its own devices, this would have been a very nice commemoration. And if you think about it, even the last week of June, when the Supreme Court actually did 2 pretty bad decisions, and then did one very good decision, the bad decisions got really eclipsed by the good decision. If you think about what has happened in our country, you have this huge chasm between rich and poor now. You have a public education system these days that whose children, where 1 out of 2 children are poor. You have a city like the city of New York, where 46% of the people who live there are poor, in probably the most affluent city in the world. This schism, this chasm, this gulf on the issue of wealth and income inequality is stunning. And at the very same time as people are feeling it, that it was very difficult for people to just open up checkbooks and say, yes, of course we must do this. Of course this is a continuation, not a commemoration. It was hard to put that together. And that is symptomatic of what's so important about this continuation. And about how we start connecting the dots that with the demise of the labor movement, with the demise of collective bargaining, comes the demise of the wherewithal to fight for a middle class, the wherewithal to have voice in the workplace. With the assault on voting rights comes the unempowerment, which then gets actually just reiterated in terms of the workplace. With the marginalization of feminism, the same thing happens. And so it feels to me, if I can make one plea in this group, we need to connect the dots amongst and between ourselves. And it seems a little silly, you know, there's a saying within the labor movement, an injustice to one is an injustice towards all. But if we don't actually connect those dots and actually represent the people beyond our individual constituencies, then we will not actually actualize the dream that Martin's father so eloquently summoned all of us to do. The shift in this country is we now believe in equality, but we do not act on those beliefs. And this march tomorrow must be the first step of the action.
Let's thank Randi Weingarten. Great job. Great job. Well, Dean Simmons, to George Mason School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, to each of the sponsors, and to many that are participating. First of all, everyone here is important. But it is extremely important today for me personally to be with a member of Mohandas K. Gandhi's family, Dr. Lakshman Gandhi. And his son with you? When we talk about nonviolence throughout our world, was because of the example of Mohandas K. Gandhi that my father studied and looked to as he and his team developed a strategy for the modern civil rights movement. And I would love to have come this evening to say that it is so wonderful to commemorate the 50th anniversary exclusively. It is great to have a commemoration, but this is a continuation, as Johnny Mack stated. Also, before I get into a little deeper words of what I want to say, I must thank Johnny Mack and Communities Without Boundaries International, along with Nan. And this team has worked so very hard to help bring us to this point. As we all will assemble tomorrow, and some of us may be here up through the 28th. The 28th is the actual day that the march took place in 1963. This year, of course, the President of the United States, along with Presidents Clinton and President Carter and others from around the world, will participate in that commemoration. An interesting dynamic. And what's actually wonderful is it's a sort of a problem that we could not anticipate having. You see, the people petitioned the government to engage the government in creating legislation for the people. But as it relates to the commemoration, the government, because the President of the United States and two former presidents, is interwoven. In 1963, I think the President was sympathetic. In fact, President Kennedy met with many of the leaders, or a delegation of the leadership of the march in 1963. But when you think about it, as I sort of remember, in 1963, this nation was extremely segregated. So there was a lot of fear. The fear was that something could happen, it could erupt. But what the leadership was able to do, meaning labor and civil rights organizations and very few business organizations, but they probably were watching, non-government organizations, what they were able to do was to create not just a coalition, but a true nonviolent demonstration of the best of what America could become. That's, I think, what makes it so memorable, because it was the best right after a very difficult period, after a little bit of time when desegregation had begun to occur. I was 5 years old, and just a year or so before the march, I was not able to go to an amusement park called Funtown in Atlanta, comparable to a Six Flags or a Great American theme park. And imagine a child passing by an amusement park every day, seeing kids just really enjoying themselves. As we took our dad to the airport, my mom drove, and we would pass by Funtown and ask Dad, you know, we'd like to go, we want to go to the park where the other kids are going. And we were not allowed to go initially. Of course, that day when we were able to go, we forgot all the times that we weren't able to. So the nation was in transition. And yes, the theme was jobs and freedom. The demonstration tomorrow is certainly still jobs, interestingly enough. Freedom and justice is added. I think that many thought that the civil rights movement had been done. Certainly in '64, a Civil Rights Act was signed by President Johnson. In '65, a Voting Rights Act by President Johnson. In '68, fair housing legislation. But in 2013, less than 2 months ago, the Supreme Court chose to gut the Voting Rights Act. And then less than 2 weeks after that, a verdict in a very interesting case, Trayvon Martin case, was rendered, that some feel was unjust. And then when you look at the fact that our nation has over 2 million people in jail. In fact, more people, they say, are in jail now of African American descent than were enslaved. That's a frightening proposition. And guess what? It's not just on the African American community to address it. It's an entire community problem that we must find a way to address. 58% of those in jail, people of color. You know, what I know is that Americans are incredible people. How do I know that? Because every time a crisis occurs, we roll up our sleeves and we come running. Some of us physically go to a site. Some of us send our children. Some of us just roll up our sleeves and go ourselves. Whenever there's a crisis, whether it's a tsunami, or whether it's a hurricane or a tornado, or whether it's a fire, Americans are willing to come and help. And when we come, we don't ask you, what religion are you? We don't ask you, what is your sexual orientation? We don't ask you, well, we're not going to help these folk because of their ethnicity. We just provide assistance. That's the best of what America produces. I'm not suggesting that we must stay in crisis all the time. I am suggesting, though, that the behavior we exhibit during crisis is behavior that we need to embrace throughout. That would be a hope. Someday we will get there. The hour certainly is getting late, and tomorrow early we will begin. 7-ish. And we will march, we plan to march promptly at 12:30. Interesting dynamic from the Lincoln Memorial to the King Memorial. So that makes it historically different. But we are marching, again, to petition our government. We've got to find a way to have an immigration policy that is sensitive and sensible. We've got to find a way to address assault weapons. Some would say gun control, but it's unfortunate we have so many guns. I don't understand that notion. But violence begets violence. Dad used to say violence is the language of the unheard. We've got to find a way so that we as a nation become stronger and can assist if others want our assistance. Other conflicts around the world, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or Turkey or anywhere in the world where violence is occurring right this moment. People are losing their lives. Or somewhere in an urban city tonight, some young person in a number of cities will lose their lives because of senseless gun violence. I often say we can and we must do better. We are a better nation than the behavior that we are exhibiting. Clearly, if my father were here, well, maybe if Dad had lived, we wouldn't be grappling with these issues, maybe some others. But we are where we are, and we don't have a moment to lose. Johnny talked about the other communities that we're going to be going to with a number of us. I believe Randi Weingarten is going to join us, maybe Lee Saunders, some others from labor, as well as some other leaders as we come around to mobilize American communities. We are going to change our nation. We're committed in a nonviolent manner to continue to challenge America to create and become the best America that it can become. And I want to finally, once again, thank each of you for being at this reception. Those of you specifically who will participate tomorrow, we thank you in advance. And we know the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first steps. We're taking some steps tomorrow. But it's not just a one-day event. It is a continuation. Thank you, and God bless you, and we'll see you very early In the morning. Now you're walking your marching shoes on.
Well, the hour is late, and we do appreciate your time.